Hey there, it's Jeremiah. A quick message before the show. Thank you all for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Patrons get access to bonus episodes that are patron exclusive, our Sticker of the Month Club, and they get access to our community Slack, where you can hang out with like-minded people and discuss politics, economics, world events, and more. Become a patron today at patreon.com/neoliberalproject, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson. Joining me today is Paul Bledsoe. Paul Bledsoe is a strategic advisor at PPI, and he's also a former advisor to the Clinton White House and has worked with the Department of the Interior, the House, and the Senate on issues of energy and climate change. And today, we're talking specifically about the European energy situation. The reason this is a big topic is obviously because Russia has invaded Ukraine in the last week. This has raised a lot of questions and led to a very severe response from the rest of the world. The list of economic sanctions on Russia keeps growing, with shipping companies saying they're not going to do business with Russia anymore, flights from Russian planes grounded all over the world, Russia's central bank assets have been seized. I'm trying to think that there's so many that it's actually hard to remember them all. Transactions with Russia have stopped as they've been kicked out of SWIFT. But one of the biggest sectors of Russia's economy is the energy sector. It's a crucial supplier of energy to the European continent. And so far, the energy sector has mostly escaped sanctions because of how strategic and important it is to Europe to be able to power and heat their homes and their lives. And it's raised a lot of questions about how can Europe stop being dependent on Russia for their gas and their oil. Natural gas and oil are two of the main exports here. And that's the real subject of today's episode. How can Europe divorce itself from Russian energy? So with that in mind, Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Good to be here.
Now, Paul, you wrote a report that was very, very well timed, I'll say. This came out in December 2021, so just a couple months ago, about the natural gas situation in Europe. And I think, we're going to link to this in the show notes. The report is very thorough. If anybody's interested in reading, go check out the link in the show notes. But before we jump into the complicated questions, let's get just a snapshot picture, a very high-level picture. Where does Europe get its energy, and how does Europe get its energy? What does the mix of sources look like?
So Europe has a broad mix of energy resources that include 15% of their electricity comes from coal, about 25 or 30% comes from natural gas. They have nuclear, they have hydroelectric, they have renewable energy. The problem is that they really need natural gas to heat their homes in the winter. And about 40% of that gas comes directly from Russia. And this addiction to Russian gas has actually increased since Putin annexed the Crimea back in 2014. And so I wrote a report saying that this was not only a geopolitical risk, and that it allowed Putin to use gas as a weapon, geopolitical weapon against Europe to try to get things he wanted, but that it had the potential, should there be some sort of new invasion after the Crimea, so the precedent was already set, to have Russian gas cut off altogether. The other, I think, new element here is that my report said that not only was European addiction to Russian gas a geopolitical problem, it was a climate nightmare. It turns out that Russia has an incredibly leaky, old, antiquated natural gas production system. And so about 7% or even more of its gas leaks into the atmosphere directly as methane. Methane is a super greenhouse gas, 80 times more powerful per molecule than CO2. And so it turns out, from a climate change perspective, Russian gas is worse than the coal Europe is substituting for. So it's a climate as well as a geopolitical disaster.
That's pretty crazy to hear that something is worse than coal for climate. Like that's not what you expect when you hear about some of this stuff, that something would be worse than coal.
That's right. It turns out that when the life cycle of natural gas from its wellhead production to its delivery to the consumer has leakages, has fugitive emissions of greater than 3.5%, natural gas is worse than coal from a climate change perspective. So European source gas has emissions of about 1 or 2% of leakage. So it's about twice as good for the climate as coal, or half as bad is a better way to put it. Russian gas looks like it's 2 or even 3 times worse in terms of causing warming than coal because of these incredibly high methane emissions. And in fact, new detection technologies from satellites have shown that Russian methane emissions are far higher than was previously suspected.
Well, let's talk about this for a second, because this is something that I think people are not necessarily aware of. Even people who like to consider themselves well-informed and they care about the climate and they follow climate change news, it might be surprising to them to hear, oh, well, natural gas is actually very different depending on where it comes from. You know, the report you have talks about what are the emissions from Russian natural gas as opposed to European sources, as opposed to natural gas that comes from America.
That's right.
Can we talk about why that happens? What are the technical factors and what are the explanations why some natural gas has higher emissions than other natural gas?
So it's all about leakage. If natural gas escapes unburned, that is methane. In essence, natural gas is methane. And so you have to have a system that is pretty airtight, that doesn't allow huge amounts of the gas through the wellhead when you drill the wells, through the gathering process of attaching the pipelines to the wells, through the pipelines themselves, through the whole life cycle. You need to have a pretty airtight system.
And in this case, airtight is not an analogy. Airtight literally.
Literally.
to stop from leaking, yeah.
To prevent leaks. And so the U.S. has a long series of regulatory and accountancy processes where we have a pretty good idea what our emissions leakage is, and we're trying to reduce it. In fact, Biden has recognized this problem, and we just got $16 billion to plug any existing leaks in the U.S. system. That's more than anybody else in the world is spending. So the U.S. government and, in fact, the industry is beginning to recognize this problem. But let's step back a little bit about methane and climate change broadly. Methane is the second most powerful forcer of climate change after CO2, after carbon dioxide. Methane is causing about a quarter of the warming on the globe today. And so the Biden administration, Europe, and 100 other countries recognized this at the recent Glasgow climate change negotiations and came up with a global methane pledge. Again, US, Europe, 100 other countries have agreed to limit their total methane emissions by about 30% by the end of this decade. Now, methane comes from oil and gas leaks. It comes from coal mines. It also comes from agriculture. It also comes from landfills. And it also comes from natural sources. But about 30% of total, 25% of total emissions come from oil and gas. So it's a main driver not only of methane leaks, but of climate change itself, of global warming. Russia, China, a bunch of the other major natural gas exporters have not agreed to this methane pledge. And so this is against a backdrop, this problem of Russian methane is against a backdrop of this broader methane problem in driving warming. There's good news here. The good news is if we cut methane quickly in this decade, we can limit near-term temperatures, and the reason is simple. Methane only stays in the atmosphere about a decade or so before it dissipates, whereas CO2 stays in the atmosphere, half of CO2 stays in the atmosphere 100 years, and 20% stays in the atmosphere 1,000 years. So it turns out limiting methane emissions is a key to controlling near-term temperatures. And yet here we have a stalwart otherwise of climate protection, Europe, addicted to gas that's worse than coal from a methane and climate perspective.
Well, so let me step back and ask, how do we know what methane emissions are? Because we talk about things coming from different sources. The Americans, have a better source. Their systems are airtight, is this what I'm hearing? And look, I can buy that. I can buy that American and European natural gas is probably more responsibly handled and that their systems are more airtight. If you told me the Soviets or the Russians have that either one of those, either when it was the Soviet Union or when it was Russia, that either one of those was sloppier with their handling of natural gas and not as airtight, I would believe that. But how do we measure that? Because it's obviously it's a difficult thing in the sense that there's all these points where you could have leakage and you might not even realize it. You'd have to be measuring it like every point of a pipeline. So how do we measure this? And how do we make sure that there's not leakages happening that we're not aware of?
So this is a hugely important question that I believe nations around the world who produce natural gas have got to pay attention to. What we do know is this, that Russia has deliberately hidden and lied about, Putin in particular has lied about its natural gas emissions. There was a Washington Post expose on this last November. The International Energy Agency just came out with a report that said that Russia had the highest methane emissions in the world, by far higher than anyone else. And even that is probably incomplete. And the reason is we don't have inspectors in the Gazprom natural gas production system like we do in the US and Europe. So the truth is we're just beginning to understand how incredibly high Russian natural gas leaks of methane are, but we also don't know the complete level of methane emissions from US gas or European gas. We're coming up with new data there too. The good news is IEA and others have found that it's in the industry's own interest to capture this gas because actually the gas has real value, right? We're just talking about leakage from the system. And so 75% of capturing gas leaks pays for itself for the industry. So the industry recognizes in the US and Europe and elsewhere that capturing this gas is in its interest, and regulators in the US and Europe recognize that it's an important thing to do. Now we've got to actually tighten down on these systems. What I recommend in my report is Europe is the largest market for imported gas in the world. I urge that European regulators require accurate accountancy of methane emissions from all sources, including imports. And then over the next few years, begin to require that no gas over a certain level of fugitive emissions of methane can reach the European market. That would be a regulatory market approach to get gas to clean up its act all over the globe. I think this has real potential to revolutionize the gas industry and to make it far cleaner. And that includes the U.S. The good news is the U.S. industry, and especially the Biden administration, has just promulgated the tightest methane regulations anywhere in the world. We think U.S. gas has a leakage rate of about 1%, maybe 1.5%. So there's still work to be done even here. Biden administration, as I said, just got $16 billion to tighten up this system, to make it more airtight, to make sure there are not leaks from new wells or from pipelines. So this is an urgent thing we need to do globally.
So let's talk about the need here and the geopolitics of it, because as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, we're talking about climate a lot here, and obviously your report was focused more on climate because at that point we didn't know that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. I'm going to give you a shout out because you did actually say halfway through your report, which is mostly focused on climate and energy impacts, but you do reference, there's a danger of a Russian invasion in Ukraine, which would accelerate the need for something like this. And 3 months later, here we are. So there's a big push for this now in a way that there wasn't before. There's a new urgency around this problem, and maybe we should have been trying to do this all along, but now we've got the urgency. Who are the players who would be most affected by this? I think it's useful to say, Europe gets their sources from blah, 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 but also within Europe, there are people who are going to be more impacted. I don't know a ton about the European split. I have this very high level view of France. France has a lot of nuclear reactors, and France gets most of it from nuclear. Germany is more dependent on Russian natural gas, but the rest of it, I'm kind of just I throw up my hands. I don't really know. So what does the breakdown look like within Europe?
Right. So parts of Eastern Europe, like Poland, are a little more dependent on coal. So is Germany, actually. They also use a lot of natural gas. France, as you say, has very high levels. About 75% or 80% of its electricity comes from nuclear power, although they've kind of doubled down on nuclear. They're diversifying. Germany has claimed that it's going to shut down its nuclear power plants, although I think in the light of the Ukraine invasion, they're going to reconsider this.
Yeah, apparently their Green Party, the Green Party, which is one of the main anti-nuclear forces there, is now saying that at least existing nuclear plants should stay on for a little while longer, which is a big shift for them.
That's right, and that's something I've suggested they might consider in a report, but now they have. The broader point is this. Europe has finally recognized, in my report, I called for Europe to produce a new energy and climate plan recognizing the problem of Russian gas. Unfortunately, it took the invasion of Ukraine for the EU to actually announce that, which they did last week. So in about 2 weeks, the European Commission is going to produce a new plan that would phase out dependence on Russian gas over time. They can't do it right away. It's 40%, nearly 40% of their total natural gas imports. But now they say they're coming up with a plan to do that. One of the key things for them to do, of course, is to produce more renewable and other forms of clean energy. They're already trying hard to do that. The Germans themselves have been leaders in this category. So they've got to produce more renewable and clean energy.
With the Germans, sorry for interrupting, but with the Germans, isn't there that push-pull of they've actually done quite well on the traditional renewables, as in solar and wind, but it's offset by the declining nuclear to where they're what you would call clean is basically staying flat. It's like nuclear being replaced by wind and solar. Is that mostly accurate for them?
That's pretty accurate, and as I said, they're continuing to use a significant amount of coal. So everybody's got to up their game here in terms of clean energy. One crucial element is Europe has got to invest in a better grid system and electricity storage that can allow them to utilize ever greater amounts of intermittent renewable energy on the grid. So there are a lot of parts to this. One other thing, though, they're going
And
to
just to zoom in on that real quick, basically the idea there is that, look, solar power gives you power when it's sunny, which is not all the time, right? There's night exists. Night is a thing, surprisingly, everywhere you go in the world. And there's parts of the year where you might not get a lot of sun, or it might be very cloudy. And so you're saying that we need a better energy system and a better storage system, a better grid, so that you can collect the energy when it's sunny and use it throughout. Is that kind of the argument?
That's right. And so electricity storage is kind of the sine qua non of clean energy policy, right? Right now, we cannot cheaply store large amounts of electricity by any method other than maybe hydroelectric dams. So what we need to do is figure out new ways to store some of the renewable electricity that is generated when the wind blows and the sun shines, and then be able to distribute it later. So that's a key element. But even if we do all those things, and Europe is going to make big new investments, they say, they're going to need new sources of gas in the near term. By near term, I mean the next 10 years, the next 15 years. And so there is a likelihood that they are also going to increase the import of what's called liquefied natural gas, which comes over in tankers from places like the United States or Australia or Iran or Qatar. Europe is going to need greater capacity to import gas through liquefied natural gas tankers.
And so basically what we're saying with that is that, look, the first best solution is always to have clean, zero carbon energy, right? That's always our first priority. But in the short term, it's simply not feasible that Europe will be able to power itself without natural gas of some kind.
That's right. And it's both electricity and heating. So it's both. Natural gas is used for both those reasons in Europe. And so this gas heating system is going to be, take a while to overhaul into electricity heating, and therefore natural gas will be particularly important in the near term. So the good news is there's a lot of natural gas in the world, and there is the ability of the U.S., Qatar, and these other exporters to produce more gas to deliver into Europe. My argument is that we need to do that in a way that limits methane emissions as much as possible so that we get the true climate change benefit, not just of phasing out Russian gas dependency, but phasing out coal in Europe. And it turns out that driving down methane emissions from natural gas is a critical element in overall climate as well as geopolitical policy. So the good news is the U.S. has increased in recent months its liquefied natural gas exports to Europe. We know that gas is much lower methane leakage rates than Russian gas. Therefore, it's better from a climate perspective. The question is how much gas from the U.S. and other Middle Eastern and other exporters can replace Russian gas, how quickly. The crucial point time is the winter, which is now winding down in Europe. And so what we'll really be looking for is how much gas can come from these other sources into Europe next year. And one of the reasons we're going to do this, apart from climate change, is that oil and gas exports are the single biggest source of revenue for the Kremlin, for the actual government of Vladimir Putin. We're talking about as much as half of the total revenue that the Kremlin uses for its war machine and everything else it does comes from oil and gas sales and exports.
There's a trendy line right now in the discourse out there, which is that Russia has basically turned itself into a gas station with an army.
Yeah, and throughout modern history, control of the oil fields and natural gas resources has been a strategic objective of dictators and tyrants throughout history. And the Russians have a lot of the resource. So a longer term question is, how can we move away from this deep reliance on oil and gas and begin to starve the beast? And that's true, not just of Russia, with obviously one of the most repressive and worst regimes in the world, and the immediate Ukrainian situation, but also petro-dictators around the world, right? There are other bad actors in Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and elsewhere. So there is a broader geostrategic goal in moving away from oil and gas, hydrocarbons as energy sources. That's going to take time, though. In the meantime, we should strategically, in my view, use U.S. oil and gas to help this whole process happen. And so we need to have a realistic view. You can't snap your fingers and displace the world's oil, for example, which in the United States still accounts for 90% of our transportation fuel. So, but we have to do it more urgently for all these climate and geopolitical reasons. And Europe is a place where this may happen fastest.
Well, so let's talk about how it would happen then, because I think we've laid out the case very well. The case is pretty obvious at this point. The climate reasons are obvious. The geopolitical reasons to not be relying on Russia are pretty obvious. And I think Europe is serious about it at this point. All the sanctions that have occurred on Russia, the only ones that really haven't been put in place that still could be are the energy sector. And I think it's because of this recognition that this is a long-term problem. But I want to ask you about some of the specifics. Let's get down into the nitty-gritty of logistics here. My understanding as someone who doesn't pay attention to this much is that there's a lot of pipelines, basically, from Russia into the European continent that carry oil and natural gas, and that these pipelines go through basically the main body through Russia, Eastern Europe, into the continent, and that's how it gets supplied. And I guess my question is, what's the alternative? Is it, the U.S. is literally sending over a fleet of ships every day with a bunch of liquefied natural gas on it? Or what's the alternative infrastructure? And what can realistically be done, say, in the next year to actually move us away? How close can we get in 1 year's time before the next cold winter happens?
Great. So good question. So the first recognition is that this is the reason we have not sanctioned Russian oil and gas, because we need it. If we were to just cut off Russian oil, the price of oil on the global market would spike to over 100 or 150 or even more per barrel. And that would just hurt the victims, right? That would hurt Europe. That would hurt the U.S. economy. So there's no reason to do that. The same, unfortunately, is true of natural gas. We're not sanctioning Russian gas because Europe needs it to get through the winter. So that's why we're not sanctioning those areas yet, because it would hurt the victims more than the perpetrator. How do we get away from reliance on Russian oil and gas? Let's focus on gas first. The pipelines go through, ironically, most of them go through Ukraine. And so one of the reasons the Ukrainians have been screaming about this natural gas problem for years, really since before the Crimea annexation in 2014, is Putin began, and Gazprom and the Germans together began an alternative to gas pipelines through Ukraine, and that was called Nord Stream 2. And that was a pipeline directly from Russia under the Baltic Sea into Germany. And believe it or not, the Germans were complicit in this entire creating and building of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is now nearly operational. It's almost ready to go. I and many others have been strong critics of this new pipeline, and yet the Germans seemed in incredible denial about its geostrategic and climate problems. So it literally, Putin announced a few months ago that it was ready to ship gas. The Germans got a little bit of cold feet, although their ex-chancellor Gerhard Schroeder was actually on the board of the biggest Russian oil company, and they proposed him to be on the board of this Gazprom Nord Stream 2 venture. And so the Europeans have been in denial about how dangerous their addiction to Russian gas is. So, what we need to do is find all other sources of gas that can come into Europe, primarily liquefied natural gas from places like Qatar, the United States, Australia, Iran, other sources, and come into ports in Europe and provide the gas. We also need Europe to begin to emphasize other forms of heating in the winter and electricity production apart from gas.
What does the infrastructure look like for this kind of thing? Like, how much could we feasibly do? I guess I'm almost hoping we can quantify this. Like, how many ports are there that can accept liquefied natural gas, and like, is it feasible that we could build more if we need to? And like, does this mean that like within a year we could knock their dependence on Russian gas down by 10% or 20% if we made like a big concerted effort?
So there's smart people working on all those questions. Nobody knows the answer. The answer to your basic questions is there are about 15 LNG terminals, import terminals in Europe. They could be expanded. The existing terminals could be expanded. New terminals could be built. Europe is already increasing its use of liquefied natural gas. So we can expand the infrastructure. We can also expand the export infrastructure in the United States and elsewhere. So that can happen. But we also need to, Europe has got to help itself by increasing energy efficiency, increasing the grid reliability, electricity storage, not taking any nuclear power offline, all of those things. We have to do all of those things at once to reduce the level of gas imports. All that being said, I don't think we're going to cut off Russian gas anytime soon. I think it'll be several years before Europe is even close to in a position to stop using the 40% of gas that currently comes from Russia. So this is not going to happen overnight. But the broader geostrategic and climate arguments are so profound that it does need to happen. And this crisis is exposing that.
It seems to me that because this is such a multifaceted problem, that the real barrier here is going to be coordination and like the continuance of the will to do this. There's certainly will to do it right now because we're less than a week from when Russia invaded Ukraine, or maybe about 1 week, depending on exactly when you want to date that. But is that will still going to be there in a month or in 6 months or in 2 years? I think that's a really important question because, as you've said, this isn't a one policy thing. This is about keeping nuclear, improving storage, ramping up your wind and solar much faster. Maybe we build more LNG ports to import the cleaner version of natural gas rather than using the dirty Russian version. There's all of these different things. Energy efficiency plays into it. I've even seen proposals that Biden should send over heating units to Europe, millions of heating units that can heat a house with electricity rather than natural gas, because that would be a step away. Even though obviously some electricity is made with natural gas too, but some of it is not. But because this is such a multifaceted problem, and you have to do so many things at once, it seems to me like coordination and will are going to be the big drivers here.
I think that's right. And so what I am arguing is not only before this, the only argument was, oh, we may have a geostrategic problem some point down the line with Russian gas. What I argue in my report is, no, we've got an immediate geostrategic problem. which the Crimea annexation was foreboding of this Ukrainian invasion. But then we have this climate disaster as well. And so we've got to act. And I think that Europe has finally recognized that this is just a fundamental problem that they have to address. In the long run, we need to wean ourselves off of oil and gas altogether. And so these investments are made for both near-term crisis and for long-range decarbonization, demethanizing our energy system. So we're going to have to do this in the long run in any event. But in the near term, we have to use those cleaner natural gas sources strategically and to help wean Europe. Now, there's a longer, even than that, run strategy here. The very pipelines that now ship natural gas all over Europe and all over the world. We haven't discussed Asia, which I'll get to in a little bit, because there's a Russia-China connection here in natural gas that we need to mention. But the very pipelines that ship natural gas have the potential to ship hydrogen. So hydrogen is not a power source, it's a power storage element. So what you do now when you create hydrogen is you burn some other natural gas, some fossil fuel, or with renewable energy, and you use power to create the hydrogen. Why would you do that? Because you can store the hydrogen. Again, the key, the sine qua non of clean electricity policy is storage of clean electricity. And hydrogen could be the answer to storing clean electricity. So in the long run, many people believe, and I tend to think they're probably right, that the infrastructure that we're creating on natural gas will eventually be used for hydrogen, which is more and more created by clean energy sources like renewable energy. And that ends up being a relatively net zero source of power that we can ship around the European continent and around the world. It can create electricity, it can heat, it can do other things. There are a lot of problems still with hydrogen in terms of creating it on a basis that you're using less energy to produce it than it gives you, and also in safety and storage and consumer use. But I think we're going to solve those problems. So these investments in the pipeline infrastructure for natural gas in the long run, in my view, are probably going to be used for hydrogen as we get closer to net zero emissions.
I think it's important to emphasize that some of the solutions here have not yet been invented. And, if we don't invent anything new, we are never going to solve climate change. It will just kill a lot of people. But what we're counting on is to invent a lot of the new things, which we're already doing to some extent. We're already, the cost of solar and wind has gone down by 90%. Batteries continue to get more and more and more efficient. Battery technology has advanced really fast. And so we are counting on being able to kind of continue some of these advances. But I want to switch away from the tech side and talk about the politics one more time in the time that we have left before we have to get off. A lot of people have been really impressed by how quickly Europe has changed in many of the areas that they've used to address Russia's invasion. And this is outside of energy policy. You see people really flabbergasted that Germany is now going to double their defense spending, or that Finland is now potentially going to commit to joining NATO, or that Switzerland woke up out of its slumber and is now doing sanctions on Russia. Switzerland, the most famous neutral country in existence. So as someone who's watched this area, you've watched politics of energy from afar in Europe, do you think that there will be a similar shift, a similar will in Europe to actually get this done? Or do you think that it's likely this is going to fade away and not much is going to happen. There's going to be a lot of talk and no action, because unfortunately that does happen sometimes. There's going to be some listeners who hear all of this and say, well, yeah, it's easy to talk about, but wake me up when Europe actually does something. Like, how would you address the chances of that?
Well, the good news is that Europe is already moving more quickly than any other region of the world toward electrification of its transportation system and away from oil. So France, Britain, other major countries in Europe are basically phasing out the internal combustion engine. It won't be available for new models by 2035 in most cases. So they are already trying desperately to move their economies away from oil, both for economic, geopolitical, and climate reasons. Now they have to do it with natural gas too at the same time. That's really hard. Don't get me wrong. That's really hard. But they are, in fact, related, right? The changes you need to make to your electricity grid system, electricity storage, efficiency, and moving away from reliance on Russian gas do have a relationship. And so I think it is going to happen because we're lining up economic incentives. In fact, electric vehicles are cheaper than internal combustion engine to operate. They're going to have no particulate emissions and therefore going to reduce health costs. So there's an economic argument, the geopolitical argument we've already covered, and then the climate argument. When you line up economics, geopolitics, and climate together, that seems a pretty strong motivation to make these big investments.
Do you think there's particular countries that are more likely to be like really gung-ho about it, whereas other countries might be much more hesitant?
Well, so far, you see the UK, Germany, being sort of major leaders. Some of the Eastern European countries have historically, like Poland, been more comfortable relying on coal resources than others. I think those attitudes in Eastern Europe may be changed by the Ukraine invasion for obvious historical and geopolitical reasons. But all of the indicators point in the same direction, which is moving away over the long term from fossil fuel dependency for economic, geopolitical, and climate reasons. And this is true in the US as well. Now, the one thing I did want to mention is that Russia, during the beginning of the Beijing Olympics, Putin traveled to China and announced with Xi a new pipeline, a second new natural gas pipeline from Russia to China. And this was seen by many geopolitical analysts as a dangerous sign that the two most powerful dictators in the world were moving toward a new strategic alliance on energy and their economies. I think this is something that really needs a lot of attention. I do not believe we can allow Russia to become the supplier of choice of natural gas for China. For one thing, it's going to be worse from a climate perspective, Russian gas, than the coal China is trying to displace. So we PPI are going to have a new report out in another month on this topic, which is how we can use gas, renewable energy, cleaner gas, renewable energy, and other resources for the Asia to shift from its reliance on coal and avoid using Russian natural gas. So this is not just a European and American problem. It turns out to be a global issue. And this is why the investments in new technologies and deployment of existing technologies is so crucial. I think the economics are getting better by the day. The geopolitics are clear and the climate risk is clear. And I think it has to be one of the global priorities to begin to wean ourselves in the long run from the worst gas first, but then from oil generally, and probably last, natural gas generally. The irony is, 10 years ago, I didn't see the technological pathway toward that. I just didn't think, it didn't, in my view, exist, at least in economically feasible manner. Now, with the huge reductions in prices, as you say, 90% of many clean technologies, with greater electric vehicles, charging, all these other new technologies, we have the capacity to do it. But we're going to need to act, or the geopolitics and the climate problems are going to catch us out.
So, we're coming up on time, and I'm going to ask the traditional final question for this podcast, which is, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more about this subject? Now, obviously, the first thing we'll say is the report that you've put out, which we have linked in the show notes. So everyone should go check that out if you want a detailed report on a divorce from Russian natural gas. But what other things would you recommend? This could be books to read. This could be other reports, white papers that have been written. It could be people to follow on Twitter who are just smart about energy policy. What would you recommend for people who want to learn more?
Well, the good news is we have all the major media outlets now paying attention to this issue given the crisis. So, the Washington Post did a big story on Europe's attempt to have a new energy and climate approach to wean itself from natural gas. So I think major media outlets are going to be covering this well. I think we need to also pay attention to what the Biden administration can do. If we're going to use our natural gas, more of it, to ship abroad, we've got to create more clean energy here domestically. Right now, Joe Manchin and a few other senators have held up the clean energy tax incentive program, $320 billion, the largest consumer incentive for clean energy in history, is pending in the Senate right now. It's already passed the House. We need to pass that because that will jumpstart all of these technologies, not just in the United States, but globally, so that the costs will come down. We'll be able to displace the worst gas. We can use a little bit more of our natural gas to go abroad. So every major country has a role in this problem. It's not just Europe. And so I think that people who are interested in these geopolitical problems have to recognize that energy underlies them, and that the economics, the geopolitics, and the climate crisis are all involved. And I think we all owe it to ourselves to educate ourselves about these clean energy, the crucial nature of developing clean energy, and to get politically active on it.
All right, well, hopefully in the long term, this is something we see. Hopefully we see Europe and the rest of the world moving away from Russian natural gas. I think there's clear geopolitical reasons and clear climate reasons for this to happen. My guest has been Paul Bledsoe. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. My pleasure.